Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a joint presentation on behalf of the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, also known as PRONI, and the Belfast Titanic Society. PRONI and Titanic Society have enjoyed a long relationship. We have annual joint lectures every September, and today we thought we'd come together and host a special event to mark the 110th anniversary of the sinking of RMS Titanic, which should be in about a little over 14 hours from now. I think well, is the time that it actually sinks. So just before I invite Susie Miller from the Belfast Titanic Society to come and introduce our guest speaker, Mark Chirnside, just want to go through a bit of housekeeping. You've all been muted so that we don't have background distractions. We are recording this event, so you can turn your video on or off. We are going out in Facebook. Hello, everybody in Facebook. And there's hopefully many of you. We had hoped that Mark would be here in person today, but unfortunately, Mark was at a gathering of people recently who all turned out to be positive with COVID, so he's not taking the risk. But we do have the pleasure of hearing from Mark directly from England. And for those of you who are on site, you can see Mark in the big screen at PRONI. So I'm going to now invite Susie Miller to come and introduce Mark. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you, Stephen. And to those of you in the room and out there virtually, thanks for joining us this afternoon for this special presentation. As Stephen said, it's a pity Mark couldn't be here in person, but this is the next best thing. So just to give you a bit of background on our speaker, Mark is a maritime historian focusing on Cunard and White Star liners of the early 20th century. He's written 8 critically acclaimed books, praised as extraordinarily researched and documented, and I can testify that that is the case. They include Olympic, Titanic, Britannic, and an illustrated history of the Olympic class ships, the big 4 of the White Star fleet, Celtic, Cedric, Baltic, and Adriatic, and Oceanic White Star's ship of the century. He's also lectured internationally and appeared on television and radio, including BBC Radio Ulster, the Antiques Road Trip, the History Channel, and RMC Découverte in French. So Mark is a Belfast Titanic Society member and a frequent visiting lecturer here in Belfast for us, and a very valued friend of the Society. And we hope that we will see him here in person in September, all being well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Susie. I appreciate your kind comments. We did a sound test earlier and everything seemed to be okay, but I hope you can still hear me, and I'm sure you'll let me know if not. Yeah, I'm quite gutted not to be with you, but at least I can do this virtually, and there's no risk of making anyone else ill. So in the title of my presentation, I guess the theme really is that it's been 110 years since the Titanic disaster, and so frequently people ask, well, what more is there to learn? You know, surely everything you'd ever want to know about this ship has been documented by now, is well known. I would argue it isn't. I would argue there's a lot more still to learn. And what I'm going to be doing is looking at a few aspects of Titanic and just sort of comparing the evidence compared to, I guess, what you'd call popular history or popular belief. So now for the second bit, hopefully you'll be able to see my slides any moment. So the first topic I'm looking at, I've called 37 seconds. You know, for Titanorachs, that is known as the, well, it's a frequent claim that Titanic and First Officer Murdoch basically had 37 seconds between the iceberg being sighted and the collision with the iceberg. So it's claimed that there were 37 seconds to avoid it. So just to look at it in more detail, and first of all, I just wanted to give some quotes from people who knew Olympic or knew Titanic. So in 1911, this was following the Hawke collision. Captain Smith was asked how Olympic steered. It is a leading question to a degree, I suppose. I think it was the White Stars Council, but he was asked, does the Olympic steer well? He said, very well. Quartermaster Robert Hitchens was, of course, the man who steered Titanic into the iceberg, but he was following orders. We won't blame him. He thought that Titanic was a good steering ship. We then also got a quote from Francis Carruthers, the Board of Trade Surveyor at Belfast, and he was asked about Titanic's trials, and during this discussion he said Titanic made a very small turning circle, and that was something that was noted. Now, where does this 37 seconds come from? Well, Quartermaster Hitchens was asked about the events before the collision, and he said that the helm was barely over when the ship struck the iceberg. He estimated the ship had swung about 2 points. Now, what we're talking about here is compass points. So 1 point is 11¼ degrees. So 2 points is 22½. And Hitchens, of course, was in the wheelhouse. He couldn't actually see what was going on. So he's basing that on the compass. We also have an estimate from Lookout Frederick Fleet. There's quite a variance here because he said a little over 1 point or 2 points. So obviously there's quite a significant difference there. But it seems that the 2 points was taken as an estimate, and Edward Wilding testified in London that they had tried Olympic, and the purpose of this test was to see how long it would take her to turn 2 points. So she was running actually slightly slower than Titanic was when Titanic struck the iceberg. But Wilding said, well, from the time the order was given to put the helm hard over until she had turned 2 points was 37 seconds. Now, he made clear a couple of years later in the limitation of liability hearings in the United States that Olympic was, she was proceeding full ahead. The order was given to put the helm hard over and also to reverse the engines. So that was the basis under which that test was taken. Now, just as a matter of interest, on Titanic's trials, she did a turning circle at full speed, and in completing the turning circle, she moved forward about 2½ lengths, so that's 2,100 feet. They also did a test, basically an emergency stop, and she was doing about 20 knots. The engines were reversed, and she stopped in 850 yards or so, which doesn't seem to be bad at all. So that equates to a little over 3 times the ship's length. And Olympic 2 did a test emergency stop. She was doing 22 knots, but she stopped in about the same time as Titanic because apparently the engines were worked somewhat quicker. So just goes to show again, you've got a variation depending on which ship it is. But essentially this 37 seconds, I mean, it's fine as an estimate if you're simply saying, well, that's how long it took Olympic to turn 2 points. But actually, this is from the time the order was given to put the helm hard over. It's not the time that the iceberg was actually sighted. And, you know, if you look at the testimony, there are inconsistencies. Frederick Fleet said that the ship had already started to turn while he was at the phone. So he'd phoned the bridge to warn that there was an iceberg ahead, and he saw that the ship was already turning while he was still on the phone. Well, if that's the case, it implies that Murdoch had potentially seen the iceberg earlier and already started to take action. There's also some contradiction in Hitchens' testimony, for example, because he estimated that the ship had swung about 2 points, but he also said the helm was barely over when she struck. So, you know, it takes several turns to get the helm hard over, and that's simply not consistent with a 2-point turn. So, you know, when you see someone claim, well, it was 37 seconds between sighting the iceberg and the collision, you know, we just need to be very careful. You know, there's that old, I think it's computer engineers, it's an expression, garbage in, garbage out. You know, it relies on the assumptions underlying it. Okay, so this is extract from the Ret Commissioner's Court, Lord Mersey, the official report of inquiry in 1912. And one of the questions, 13, was the ice seen and reported beforehand? What measures were taken? And in the answers, the ice was seen immediately before the collision, and helm was put hard a starboard, which of course means the ship will turn to port, and the engines were stopped and then put full speed astern. And that's the typical, the popular history, if you will. That's pretty much the scenario that's portrayed in, you know, films such as A Night to Remember, and more recently the James Cameron film. And certainly I think the vast majority of books on the subject relay this as well. Now, if we look at the testimony of the people on the bridge, there is a slightly different picture that emerges. Now, we had accounts from 4th Officer Boxall, Quartermaster Oliver and Quartermaster Hitchins. So we'll look at the two quartermasters first. Now, Quartermaster Oliver and Quartermaster Hitchins both gave very similar accounts. You know, they explained it slightly differently, but their accounts are very consistent in terms of the sequence of events. So they described that Captain Smith entered the bridge, that Captain Smith asked what the matter was, or what was that, that Murdoch's response was that either we had struck an iceberg, or, direct quote, an iceberg, sir. Then that Smith ordered the watertight doors closed, but Murdoch responded to the effect that, whatever the words were exactly, he responded that the doors were already closed. And it should be noted as well that if the switch on the bridge to close the watertight doors hadn't been activated, then the doors should have closed automatically, because there was a backup system, an automatic float, if flooding occurred. And this was tested and it worked when Olympic collided with HMS Hawke, or rather Hawke collided with Olympic, whichever way you say it, in 1911. Now, the different account here comes from 4th Officer Boxall, and this is the traditional account, if you will. So I had to cut it quite a lot. This is all from the British Inquiry, so you have a very similar story in America. And of course, these testimonies are all online, thanks to some great work by volunteers at the Titanic Inquiry Project. So it's all available to go through, and it's fascinating stuff, really. So Boxall, initially he's in agreement with the two quartermasters. You know, the captain asked what had been struck. Murdoch said an iceberg. And just skipping to the bottom, that Murdoch then confirmed the watertight doors were closed. But Boxall relays an account in the middle. So that after Murdoch explained they'd struck an iceberg, Murdoch explained the action he'd taken to try and avoid it. So he quoted Murdoch as saying, "I put her hard a starboard, run the engines full astern, but it was too close and she hit it." Now, Boxall also said that he'd seen the engine telegraphs. So immediately after the impact, he noted that the engine order telegraphs on the bridge were indicating full astern. And then just again, Smith, in conversation with Murdoch, asked what the ship had struck. I think Walter Lord pointed out, it's interesting actually, he didn't immediately assume, have we struck an iceberg? He said, what had we struck? So it apparently wasn't his immediate thought. And then again, Boxall quotes Murdoch with the account of saying, put the helm hard a starboard, reverse the engines, and also that he was going to do a harder port manoeuvre around it, but she was too close. Now, this account of what Murdoch said to Smith, in other words, his avoiding action, is at odds with both the quartermasters. You know, the quartermasters' testimonies are both very consistent. Smith simply said, what had they struck? Murdoch said an iceberg. Then they moved on to, well, are the watertight doors closed? Whereas in Boxall's account, he's quoting Murdoch explaining all the manoeuvres that he'd taken to try and avoid the iceberg. But if we simply look at the weight of accounts, Boxall's testimony is very much at odds with the other two men on the bridge. You know, and perhaps because he's an officer, I think his testimony tends to be given greater weight. But if you go by the weight of numbers, we've got two quartermasters giving a consistent story, and Boxall giving something of a contradictory account. Now, in terms of the engines, we've got testimony from a greaser working below. He said he felt a shock. He assumed or thought it was something in the engine room that had gone wrong. And he said he noticed the telegraphs ring, and he said that he noticed the order was stop. And that order came through on the main engines. So in later testimony, he goes on to say that this is quite a while after the collision. There were some manoeuvres in terms of either going slower ahead, slower stern. But in terms of immediately before the collision, he noticed the telegraph signals stop. So, you know, by his testimony, the engines weren't ordered to reverse. We've also got leading stoker Frederick Barrett, not a leading fireman, as is sometimes described. And he explained in his testimony that one rating was actually more senior to the other, and he was famously, of course, in forward boiler room before the collision, and he noticed the order come through. A red light came on, and he explained the red light goes up when the ship is supposed to stop. You get a white light for full speed, and he thought it was a blue light for slow. Now, Barrett was in charge, so he called out to the boiler room personnel, shut the dampers. So it was basically, as he explained, to shut the draft off the fires in the boilers. And that seems to be more consistent with the engines being ordered to stop, because if the engines were going to go full astern, you still need a head of steam. Whereas if the engines are being ordered to stop, you're less likely to need the steam, as if the engines were going to be operating still. Now, there are quite a few accounts from passengers and crew. One first-class passenger was quite familiar with engines just from his professional job. His wife woke him up, and he said he heard a slight crash. He paid no attention to it until he heard the engines stop. And it seems that the engines stopped after the crash, based on what he said. And we have a greaser, Thomas Ranger, who noticed a slight jar, and then he was working down below. He said about 2 minutes afterwards, he looked around and saw that the turbine engine had stopped. You know, potentially that implies that the turbine engine stopped after the collision, or at least if it did stop earlier, he didn't notice it. You know, there were some people that said it felt, you know, perhaps as if the engines had been reversed. There was an able seaman, John Poindexter, and he was asked, can you tell me this? At the time you felt the shock, do you think your engines were working astern or working ahead? And he said, I felt the vibration, but could not say whether the engine was going ahead or astern. And he was then asked, but it was a big vibration, was it? He said, yes. And then he was asked a sort of vibration that would tell a sailor that probably the engines were going astern. So again, something of a leading question. And he said, yes. But really, you know, how do you distinguish between vibration caused by hitting an iceberg or vibration with the engines going astern? Second Officer Lightoller was on Titanic's trials. He was there when she did the emergency stop. He knew, you know, the serious nature of the vibration and how noticeable it was when the ship is going ahead and the engines are suddenly reversed. And, you know, the the relatively light nature of the collision and the slightness of the vibration just doesn't seem to match with that very much. So, you go through so many passenger accounts, but it does seem very much like it was just the sort of light vibration in terms of the iceberg collision, and it wasn't the sort of serious vibration from the engines being reversed. And in fact, Fourth Officer Boxall was the only one that seems to have testified that Murdoch had ordered the engines reversed before the collision. It seems more likely from the weight of evidence, in my opinion, that Murdoch ordered the engines stopped, and for whatever reason, maybe to protect the propellers. Olympics propellers had been injured twice in 1911, once by a tugboat just bent them slightly on her maiden voyage, and also a few months later with the Hawke collision, and the blades actually sliced into HMS Hawke and got sections chipped out. Okay, so next topic, it's on the subject of lifeboats, and any of you who attended my talk last September, I went on for about an hour or so going through all of the evidence with regard to lifeboats, and this was an example I used at the time. But essentially it's a case of inaccurate information presented on a popular television series. And I'm using this particular program as an example. I'm not picking on it. You could choose lots of programs where there are inaccuracies, but this was part of a series, The Liners Ships of Destiny, and Destiny. It was shown in the late 90s in the UK on Channel 4. I believe it's been shown elsewhere, and it displayed with a so-called Thomas Andrews notebook. In reality, it doesn't look like it was Andrews' personal notebook. It seems to be a Harland and Wolff drawing office notebook. The handwriting, I'm not an expert, but I have seen Andrews' handwriting, and it doesn't really seem to match. And the documentary claimed it was evidence that the shipbuilder Harland and Wolff had originally designed the ships with boats for all, but had then decimated the lifeboat capacity. Now, in my talk in September, I went through all the evidence, and I said, well, what I think actually happened was that Harland and Wolff and Alexander Carlisle in particular were planning ahead. As we know, the Board of Trade didn't require enough lifeboats for everyone on board, but by 1909, 10, 11, and going into 1912, there was a feeling that the regulator in the future would require more boats be fitted, and they were certainly revising the lifeboat regulations. So their purpose of including the Welling davits was that additional lifeboats could be carried in future without having to go to the effort or the expense of installing yet more lifeboat davits, because these davits could take several lifeboats per pair. But if we just see a clip and then of how the program presented it, and then I'll just do a bit of analysis.
Andrews also kept a small notebook in which he meticulously detailed every aspect of the construction. Modifications were made in red. A change to cornices here, to light fittings there. And it's in this small book, forgotten for all these years, that a new detail in the Titanic story comes to light. Harland and Wolff had designed both ships with not only enough lifeboats to accommodate more than 3,500 people, but with spare capacity for a further 65 passengers. But on the adjacent page, the portentous red ink. The lifeboat capacity for the liners had been decimated in the stroke of a pen. But on whose instructions?
Okay, so it looks and sounds pretty authoritative, and even today, you get people who've been interested in Titanic for a long time, and they remember this being shown in the late 90s. It was also in a book which accompanied the television series. But unfortunately, the way this was presented was to mischaracterize the document. So if we take a closer look, unfortunately, I've only got a black and white copy, but it is the same document. Now we need to do this the wrong way round. So we're starting on the right, excuse me, the right-hand page. So you can see the top there, page 44. Yes, there's a load of lifeboats specified, and yes, that is all crossed out. However, what is crossed out there is the original lifeboat configuration on Olympic. So this is the lifeboat configuration on Olympic when she was completed in 1911. Now, the reason that it's been crossed out is because in 1913, 1912-13, that winter, Olympic returned to Harland & Wolff's in Belfast for a refit. And they improvised, they added a new page. So, well, it was an unused page, so shall we say, on the left, and that's what we're looking at, a double page spread. So the left-hand page is actually unnumbered, but it would be page 43 if they had numbered it. And the page on the left has the lifeboat accommodation after Olympic's 1913 refit. So you can see at the bottom there, says spare capacity for 65. That is Olympic's configuration in the 1913 refit. It is not an original design proposal for Olympic and Titanic while they were being constructed. And if you look as well, that page on the left, you've got some text underlined and the calculations at the bottom, and you've got the table there, but then none of that is crossed out. It's underlined, it's not crossed out. And if we can just flip it somewhat and zoom in. So you can see here at the left-hand side of the table, these are the notations. So if you look at the right, at the bottom, boats originally fitted to comply with the old Board of Trade regulations. So that's the top 3 rows of the table. And they were already there in 1911. And then on the left at the bottom, new boats to comply with new Board of Trade regulations. So again, it's making it very clear that those are the new boats fitted in 1913. They are not boats that were proposed to be fitted originally, and they were not crossed out. So, you know, you can see the way it was presented on the programme. It looked very authoritative, but actually, if you look at the documentation, it's not how it was portrayed. You know, things not being as they're portrayed is quite a common theme with Titanic. So a good example of this is photos of the ship. So there are no known photos, for example, of Titanic's grand staircase. There are no photos of her second or third class accommodation. And, you know, to a large extent, we basically assume that Titanic was the same as Olympic unless we find out otherwise. So, you know, an example where we know they were similar is the first class lounge. There's a section of wood from above the door, which was salvaged from the sea after Titanic sank. And if we compare that with the surviving wood from both Britannic and Olympic, it's very similar indeed. You know, obviously there are slight differences, but the design is basically as similar as it can be. But so often we simply assume that Titanic was the same as Olympic. You know, we know from exploring the wreck, for example, that the elevator or lift grills or gates were different. And, you know, without the wreck, we wouldn't have known otherwise. Now, propeller photos are a very good example of images that are miscaptioned, even in what you might think of as reliable sources. And again, I'm not picking on this publication. You know, you could pick many journals and make the same mistake. But this is an article in National Geographic a couple of months back. It says it's a 1911 photo, and it says it's Titanic. Well, neither of those are correct. And the reason we know it's incorrect is that the photographer for Harland and Wolff was a guy called Robert John Welch. He was born 1859 and lived to 1936. And over the years, he took thousands of photographs on the glass plate negatives of ships that Harland and Wolff completed. And it's really a remarkable photographic record. And what he did was give each of them a index reference number. So he then took his catalogue, if you will. So you've got each photo negative. You've got the original glass plate. This is the reference number, and then this is the subject. This is the ship. This is the date. And by looking at this, so it's a primary source document, his record of what he'd photographed. We know which photos are which. And actually, this particular photo, it's not 1911. It was taken on the 29th of January 1924. And of course, as we know from the date, that is not Titanic, it's Olympic. But it's a great photo. I mean, it's iconic. You know, you've got the shipyard workers all looking up at the propellers in awe. And, you know, I can understand why people want to use it. The travelling artifacts from Titanic were on display in the Netherlands a few years ago, and I saw the exhibition. It was great. And you had this, you know, on a huge banner over the wall of the building. So you can quite understand why people want to use it. It's such a lovely photo. And in fact, although you can't see it in this image because it's been cropped a bit, there are some slight physical differences between Olympic and Titanic. A slight difference in the plating near the rudder, which reflects a repair done in 1922. So even ignoring the catalogue, it's not Titanic, we know it's Olympic. But again, this highlights the importance of primary sources instead of secondary sources, because if we look at the bottom, you know, they've got the photograph from a picture library, essentially. So it's, I expect National Geographic, they've reported it in good faith based on what the picture library description is, but they haven't checked the original photographer's records. Now, of course, they say a lie can be round the world before the truth has got its shoelaces tied. You know, I think that's all the more true today. We see again, you know, this was used to represent Titanic. And I've cropped out the Facebook page. I actually contacted them and provided the documentation. And they later corrected the caption, and you know, they were very grateful for it. So you know, it's great that people you know, take it seriously, that they want to be accurate. Nonetheless, it was a popular Facebook page of historic photos, thousands of subjects, and it had been shared over 2,300 times in 13 hours, and that had hit over 10,000 shares after 5 days. So you can just see how quickly inaccurate information spreads. You know, that's all happened before it was corrected. And then we've got here photo of the casting, the four-bladed center propeller for Olympic. You can just see at the bottom, you've got the reference H1457. RW is the photographer's initials, and again, you know, from that we know it's a photo of Olympic's propeller. And Olympic again, this time the numbers the bottom right. And again, Olympic, so I've just zoomed in, reference number is H1514 with the photographer's initials. And if you zoom in closely, you can actually make out the name Olympic on the ship's stern, which is another clue that it's not a photo of Titanic. But again, you know, this photo will appear so often captioned as Titanic. And I'm not sure how well you can see, but if you look down towards the center propeller aperture, so the top right of the aperture, so after the center propeller and just above, there is a little plate on the side of the ship, which you can see has got eight bolts on. Now, as a bit of trivia, Titanic had a similar plate, but there were a different number of bolts there. I think it was 5 instead of 8. But again, that's a physical difference, how you can tell the ships apart. And, you know, in fact, all of this information is very well documented online. So National Museums Northern Ireland have got the photo catalogue online. You can search by ship, you can search by subject. You know, if people just check this, they can see very clearly which ship is which. But you see so often Titanic photos are, sorry, Olympic photos are used to stand in for Titanic. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's just important to be clear, you know, in captioning, this is an Olympic photo. And, you know, you can then say, well, this gives an idea of what Titanic would have looked like. And I've been focusing on the propellers as a topic because there are no known photos of Titanic in dry dock with her propellers fitted. You know, there are more propeller photos, but these are all Olympic, and I've taken, I've gone through the majority of them. But for decades, it seems to have been assumed that Titanic's propeller configuration was the same as Olympic. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable assumption on its own, but actually there is evidence that that tells us otherwise. And you know, to be quite honest, I think there was always some grounds to question this assumption. J. Bruce Ismay testified at the Wreck Commissioner's inquiry in London that Harland and Wolff had advised White Star that they expected Titanic to be slightly faster than Olympic. Well, you've got to question, well, how does that work? Because they're identical ships, you know, if they're loaded in the same way, they're the same weight, and they've got the same propelling machinery. So why is it that one would be slightly faster than the other if all else was equal? So actually there were grounds to think that Titanic's propeller configuration might be a bit different. Now, what we're looking at here is a photo of an engineering notebook. This is in the collection of records at Harland and Wolff that now sit with PRONI. So Harland and Wolff's records were deposited between 1972 and 1994. It includes several engineering notebooks, and these notebooks record the technical specification of each ship that they completed. And the specifications include the engine details and the propeller details. And, you know, just in the same way that Harland and Wolff had books keeping a record of each ship order. So, you know, it gives the date of ordered, date of order was placed, date of contract, where applicable, date the keel was laid, date the double bottom was framed, date the ship was launched, and so on. They kept a detailed set of engineering notebooks. Now, I first became aware of this information way back in 2007. I was working with a local lady, Jennifer Irwin from Historical Research Associates, and she helped me access the records at a time when I wasn't able to travel to Belfast. Now, you can just see here, you know, there's reams of technical detail. So it's a rivet counter's dream, basically. But just to give an overview of the sort of information in the book, you've got the shipyard number on the left, of course, 400 and 401, Olympic and Titanic, dimensions, gross tonnage of the ships, displacement, basic engine specifications. So this is the cylinders, then propeller shafting, boilers. I mean, it's all there. And it's important to note here, this is spread over 4 pages. So what we're looking at here, on the left, it's the first left-hand page. Then on the right is the first right-hand page. But you notice that the right-hand page is actually narrower than the page on the left. So there's I think it's about ½ an inch or so in the actual document. But the right-hand page is shorter. And the reason for that is you need to flip the right-hand page over. And if you flip the right-hand page over, like we see here, it then goes on. So it goes on to talk about the propellers, further engine details, and then bearings, pumps, all sorts of mind-numbing detail and technical specification. And I've just photographed it here. You can see the where the page has been turned, and it's just slightly up. So these are basically pages 3 and 4 for each ship. And focus here is the propellers. So I've just enlarged it. We've got the propeller section. So under the propeller headings, notebook records diameter of propellers, the pitch of the propeller blades, area of the propeller blades, and then finally the number of propeller blades for each propeller. And rather frustratingly, Olympic and Titanic are at the bottom of the page. So that's why I've shown you this here. And we're now going to zoom in on Olympic and Titanic near the bottom. Right, so what we're now seeing, we've of course got an entry for the reciprocating engine propellers, which is port and starboard propellers, and the turbine-driven propeller, which is the center propeller. And so it follows the order. So we look at Olympic, number 400, diameter of the reciprocating engine propellers, 23.5 feet, pitch is 33, blade area is 160 square feet, and then 3 as the number of propeller blades. And entry beneath it for the turbine-driven center propeller, which we saw a photo of earlier, exactly the same format. So you can see it's smaller in diameter, the pitch is less, blade area is less, and it's got 4 blades instead of 3. And although I've had to crop it out, you can see an asterisk at the top right. That tells us that the pitch of 33 feet was later changed to 34.5. And the interest here is in seeing why or how Titanic was different. So we look at 401, reciprocating engine-driven propellers. So the port and starboard propellers on Titanic, diameter the same, 23.5 feet. They were going to be 34.5 feet in pitch, same as what Olympic had been changed to late in 1911. But that was then crossed out, and they apparently changed their minds and increased the pitch to 35. As they were constantly trying to experiment with, what's the best propeller configuration, what's the most efficient, and what's the most comfortable in terms of vibration. And blade area is the same, 160, and again 3 blades as well. So the port and starboard propellers identical to Olympic, except they've changed the pitch of the blades slightly. And the most significant difference with Titanic is the turbine-driven propeller, the center propeller. So you can see it's larger, it's 17 feet in diameter, pitch is the same, 14.5, blade area is the same, but number of blades is 3, not 4. So it appears that the assumption that people made for decades and that was accepted as fact, that simply does not accord with Harland and Wolff's records. This is a document, it's a primary source, so it's far preferable to any secondary source such as a book or a television program. And it's the shipbuilder's record for the specifications of each ship that they completed. And the whole purpose of this book was to record the specifications. They could see which ships had the same features in certain ways, and also what the differences were. Now, oddly enough, Harland and Wolff, they completed a number of ships with the combination machinery. So this is the reciprocating engines exhausting into a low pressure turbine. And if we look at the period up to about January 1914, their records show they built Laurentic, Demosthenes, hope I'm saying that right, Titanic, Arlanza, Andes, Ceramic, Catamba, and Alcantara, all with a configuration which had a 3-bladed center propeller. And in fact, in the years up to 1914, Olympic is the exception. She's the odd one out in having a 4-bladed center propeller. Now, this document, as I said, I became aware of it in 2007. It was published in 2008. And shall we say, there was quite a reluctance among people to believe it. You know, the decades-long assumption that Titanic's propellers were the same as Olympic is not in accordance with Harland and Wolff's records. So essentially, the theory that Titanic's propellers were the same has now been superseded because we've got primary source evidence which documents that Titanic was different. And, you know, people have said, oh, well, I'm not going to believe this document because there's no date on it. I said, well, okay, but why would there be a date on it? This was a document that they updated over time. Each ship's entry was added in as the ships were completed. You know, it doesn't have a date as such. It's a working document. So I wouldn't expect there to be a date on it. And, you know, for example, there's not a date in the Harland and Wolff ship order book either. Others have said, well, I'm not going to believe it because there's no signature. Again, why would there be a signature? I wouldn't expect there to be. It's a document recording for information, the specifications of each ship. It's not a contract. It's not a decision by Lord Pirrie or any of the Harland and Wolff managing directors that was a written order that was signed off. It's not a document which is an order from a ship owner to the shipbuilder signing off an order. So again, I wouldn't expect there to be a signature there at all. And another person said that they wouldn't believe it because it was only penciled in. So they're implying that a 3-bladed propeller was penciled in and may then have been changed. Well, as you can see, it's simply not true. This is in black ink. There's a modification in red ink, but there's no penciling at all. And again, it's not a working document. It represents each ship as completed. And really, the only exceptions here are the change to Olympic's reciprocating engine driven propeller pitch late in 1911, and the last minute change to Titanic's port and starboard propeller pitch early in 1912. And again, you have to say, well, if this wasn't Titanic's completed configuration, then you would expect the turbine entry to be crossed out and changed. And, you know, that's simply not the case. So there's really no reason to disbelieve this document or this evidence. I think the issue is we've got a natural familiarity bias as human beings. You know, the Olympic propeller configuration was just assumed to be Titanic's. That was accepted as fact for decades. And, you know, people then struggle, and we see that the evidence that we've now got available is to the contrary. Now, some further research was done by João in 2019, I think it was, and I became aware of his work in January 2020. This is an extract from a notebook in the papers of Sir Stephen Piggott. Now, Sir Stephen Piggott worked for John Brown's for decades, and he made a key contribution to Scottish marine engineering. He was American born. March 1908, he went to London to outline the development of the Curtiss turbine to the British Admiralty. Now, while he was on his trip, so that summer, he made contact with John Brown and co. They'd recently completed Lusitania, and he returned from America to the UK to work with John Brown's for 4 to 6 months. But it ended up being a permanent basis, and the managing director of John Brown's, Sir Thomas Bell, invited Piggott to work there permanently as a turbine engine specialist. And Piggott was promoted to Engine Works Director in 1919, ultimately became the managing director of John Brown's in 1938 after Sir Thomas Bell retired. King George VI knighted him in 1939. He retired in 1949 and then passed away in 1955. And he was involved with a large number of turbines for naval and merchant ships. They included HMS Tiger, HMS Hood, battleships HMS Barham and Vanguard, the Canadian Pacific Line's Empress of Britain, many Cunard liners, so that includes Aquitania, Caronia, also Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. And this notebook has entries for a number of ships, but what interests us here is that these are entries for Olympic and Titanic. Now, why might that be? Well, we know that Holland and Wolff were cooperating with John Brown's, and they wanted access to the turbine technology, and it seems that they drew upon Stephen Piggott's expertise in the design of Olympic and Titanic's center propellers. Now, I appreciate there's loads of detail in these entries, but what we're focusing on here is, a generic description. So the top of each page, it just says center propeller, Olympic and Titanic. So we don't know which is which. But if we look left-hand page, sort of the top quarter, you can just about see 17,000 SHP, and then going down a bit, that says three-bladed. It's talking about a three-bladed propeller design that delivers about 17,000 shaft horsepower, and the speed would be about 22 knots. And then moving over to the right-hand page, again, just slightly further up, you can see 17,000 SHP, 22 knots. On the right, it says 170, so that's 170 revolutions a minute. And below 17,000 SHP, you've got four-bladed. So he's come up with two propeller designs, one's three-bladed and one is four-bladed. And each page, if we look at the left-hand page, for example, the bottom right quarter of that, you can see heading proposed propeller, and then it's got various specifications under that. So it's got 17 feet, which is the diameter. You've then got a pitch of 15 feet 3 inches, and then going down you've got blade area and so on. So essentially the propeller specifications in the notebook in the Stephen Piggott papers are for a four-bladed propeller and a three-bladed propeller that are identical to the propeller specs in the Holland and Wolff documentation for each ship as completed. They're identical in terms of diameter of propellers, blade area and number of blades. The only difference is that they appear to have varied the pitch of the propellers on the final design. So this notebook entry seems to date from around the summer of 1910. So it's while the ships were under construction. But nonetheless, we now have a second primary source document which gives strong circumstantial support to the Holland and Wolff documentation. Excuse me. Now, Titanic is seen here in dry dock in 1912. There's an object on the barge, as we call it. It appears to be a propeller. Now, we don't want to jump to conclusions. You know, you can't necessarily assume that was intended for Titanic, although I think in all likelihood it was. But Sam Halpern, who was one of my colleagues, did a mathematical analysis to do with the angle of the blades and so forth, and the shape of the propeller. And Tony Taylor did some 3D computer-aided design models. So he fed the specifications of the propellers from the Holland and Wolff records into the design program. And the result of Tony's work is here. At the top is a 3D CAD model of a marine propeller, and he based it on Holland and Wolff's propeller specifications. You know, you can see from the angle of the blades, well, a three-bladed center propeller, they're not going to be at 90 degrees as a four-bladed propeller would be. So the angle of the blades will be different. And just in comparing them, the object on the that's photographed on the barge does look like a very close match indeed for the three-bladed centre propeller in the Harland and Wolff records. And just another view, he did an Olympic centre propeller model as well. And you can just see at the bottom, so the sort of side-on view for both propellers rather than the direct view ahead. You can just see that a four-bladed centre propeller from the side does look quite different. And no matter how he tried, and also Sam was looking at different four-bladed propellers, they simply couldn't get a four-bladed propeller to match what was photographed on the barge. Now we've also got evidence from 1913, so this is Olympic, and in that 1912-13 refit, her propellers were tweaked again. And the key here is if we look at the far right column, so right at the top it says centre, so that's centre propeller, number of blades 3, diameter 17 feet, pitch 14, and blade area 125. So you can see it's actually a three-bladed propeller, but it's actually got a larger blade area because the individual blades are larger. You know, this has been known for quite some time, back to the late 90s. You know, it was known that Olympic had a propellers change in 1913. It was pretty widely accepted based on this documentation, but again, I don't know why there's therefore such controversy about Titanic. And got here a great piece of digital artwork, and Vasily has done some really stunning images of a Titanic. He's done this again based on the propeller specifications in the Harland and Wolff documentation, and he's just added a man for scale. So I think this is probably as close as you'll get to what Titanic's propeller configuration looks like. But yeah, just in terms of themes then, so after 110 years, I think there's still a lot more to learn. We need to look at primary sources rather than just, you know, assumptions that are repeated and taken as fact. We need to be much more careful in our analysis, and there will always be more to learn. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. Yes, the Harland and Wolff evidence was not available at PRONI until it may have been as late as 1994. But even if so, there's still 13 years that have elapsed. And even today, I don't think it's widely accepted because people and publications, they simply repeat outdated assumptions, even though, you know, for 15 years now, we've had evidence to the contrary. So it goes to show just how entrenched certain assumptions or myths are, and how hard they can be to shift, even with very compelling evidence. Okay, so I hope I haven't run on too long, but thanks for listening.